Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Underground Storage Tanks, Preparing and Responding to Extreme Events. The last 15 minutes of this webinar will be left for questions and answers on the presentation. Anyone on today's webinar may receive a certificate of attendance. You will need to attend the live webinar for 60 minutes. If you did not request a certificate of attendance upon registration and you would like one, send an email to EPA-webinar-series@icf.com. Just a note, EPA cannot guarantee acceptance of certificates by your organization, nor can certificates be provided for viewing the webinar recording. Thank you for being with us today, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Alex Hall, a geographer in US EPA's Office of Research and Development, is responsible for data analytics and development of GIS tools that address source contaminants and impacts on water quality. Dr. Fran Kramer, a senior scientist in EPA's Office of Research and Development, has conducted foundational work in understanding the characterization and treatment of contaminant sources and led field projects ranging from treatment of contaminated shoreline in the Exxon Valdez oil spill to assessing impacts of flooding and debris management in the Hurricane Katrina response. And now I will turn it to our first presenter, Dr. Fran Kramer. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, and glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation for Alex and me to talk with you today about our work on underground storage tanks and particularly its relevance to extreme weather events. We've got an hour here. We've got a lot of material to cover, and we're going to do this succinctly but quickly. So grab a drink if you already don't have one in hand, and we're gonna hit go here. Okay, so our underground storage tank universe. We have in the next slide just an overview here of what we're going to walk through today. Looking at underground storage tanks and fuel supplies in general on how this relates to our construct nationally in emergency response and preparedness. Then we're going to walk into a demo that Alex is going to show you of the tool itself. And subsequent to that, we'll be addressing specifically water and indoor air impacts to think about both in terms of a preparation mode, but also a response mode. And likewise here too, Alex will do a demo of the application and where this fits in specifically for these impacts. And then we're going to finish up with different scenarios in terms of looking at extreme weather and climate change, what this means to the vulnerability of our tanks, and again, demonstrating this with the application itself. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with the underground storage tanks universe, it is a very sizable universe here in the country. And actually, in having this UST Finder application and data, it's the first national accounting that we've had. And within about the last year, this has been developed and fully available. So it gives us the information finally in terms of what's the historical use as well as the present universe of underground storage tanks. So historically, we have well over 2 million underground storage tanks at some 800,000 facilities and 500,000 leaking underground storage tanks. So historically, we're looking at 1 in 4 of the tanks have leaked. Presently, we're at about 500,000 active underground storage tanks at a little less than 200,000 facilities and a backlog of about 62,000. So we're up about 1 out of 10 leaking underground storage tanks in the US. But I think the bottom line here in terms of our active universe, we're storing up to 6 billion gallons of fuel on any given day in this country. So we have a lot of fuel, and as you'll see here on the right-hand side, and Alex is going to demonstrate, obviously where our fuel supplies are also where our people are. Our gas stations are, of course, located next to our populations. And in terms of the potential impacts, groundwater is very much on our mind and a considerable concern in terms of impacts to public health. This really drives a major part of our program, but as well, we're interested in petroleum vapor intrusion where structures may be located next to underground storage tanks and leaks. Increasingly, as you'll see throughout here the next hour, the weather conditions and looking at extreme events and how that may alter the conditions, both spatially and temporally, and movement of contaminants is significant. So in putting this in the next slide, in terms of the context of emergency response, we have national critical functions, and these are inherent functions of the government and the private sector that we look at for the security of a nation. And so what are these factors relative to any significant impact with regard to our security, including economic security, our public health, and ultimately our safety? And with the NSF, there was a risk management framework that really lays out what these critical infrastructures are and how they interrelate with each other. With these, there are some 55 national critical functions, but today we're going to focus on the key ones relative to underground storage tanks. And this is going to be in terms of the supply chain, both the fuel supply, but as well the water supply, because we are very much focused on the impacts to water supply as a result of impacts to the fueling stations. And then ultimately, what are the threats and the hazards that could impact these facilities in the supply chain? So, which is why we're spending a fair amount of time here in this hour addressing climate change. And here briefly is just this emergency support function that deals with infrastructure too. The Department of Homeland Security is the lead agency, EPA is a support agency on this, but again, this is whole of government and as well the private sector in ensuring this supply. And in terms of the fueling stations, yes, they are critical in disaster response in so many ways. You can imagine in terms of the impacts of an extreme event coming to a community, how do we look at these communities? How do we help prepare them to really bolster what that infrastructure is and how, in terms of the owners and operators, how do we get information to them about hardening facilities and damage that could be at each location? So US Finder gives us a way really to look at the geospatial data as well as the infrastructure data to think about the next steps in really providing that approach to hardening the infrastructure. The fuel stations themselves are important both in terms of preparedness as well as response. And in terms of the response effort, yes, it's important for our first responders, but as well, it's very important for our evacuees and as well, we need to have fuel to bring people back home. So having our facilities up and operational is very much a key part of how we look at this. And the picture on the right-hand side just shows you a snapshot of a station that was inundated during Harvey. And this is a station that we're finding there's not a lot of these, but this one had over 100 dispensers at the station. All of the dispensers had emergency response personnel there. It had newly opened and it was on high ground. So again, we know that we've got to locate these in places that will help both in our preparedness and response. And the next slide just briefly shows you in terms of NOAA's recent release of the 2021 disasters that occurred in the country. Again, we're been on record here with the highest number of billion-dollar weather events, and for a variety of reasons, from flooding to tornadoes to drought. So we know this is going to be a part of our life and increasingly have to be better prepare for these events. And then the next one here for US Finder in terms of looking both at preparedness and response at both sides of the house. So for preparedness, the US Finder will help us get information about what are these hazards, where are the areas that are going to be subject to climate change, and how do we identify those a priori. Then secondly is identifying where are these facilities located and where are the water sources relative to our facilities located. And then on the right-hand side, in terms of looking at response, again, thinking about hazards, where are we going to have releases? And so we know, obviously, if we have leaking underground storage tanks already, those are going to be front and center, but also if we have underground storage tanks that may not have leaked, they still are posing a risk, particularly under inundation, because there are many portals for entry of water into our system and displacing the fuel. So that's absolutely a concern. And then secondly, it gives us information on really how to better characterize and thinking about remediation of these releases. And then last but not least, in terms of really triaging these cleanups, where do we go after the impacts in terms of what are the public health concerns, where are drinking water supply concerns, and we can do this in a way that, very strategically and geospatially with US Finder.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. And I'll just jump in here. Basically, the purpose of US Finder was to provide, readily readily available information to emergency response, right? And that's mainly the question of where are these facilities? Where are these leaking underground storage tanks? Where are these underground storage tanks? Prior to a little over a year ago, we didn't know on a national scale. All this data was housed in states, and it was never collected into kind of a national picture. So that's really kind of the first key thing that we're providing is the where. Now the what, that would be, how old is this infrastructure? We know that the longer you put metal in the ground, the more structural issues you're going to have with it. There's microbially induced corrosion, pitting, issues with sealants, things like that. So now we've got a really good understanding because of this collection of data of basically how old our infrastructure is. Related to that, we know what fuels are being stored. We want to know what types of fuels are stored because there's compatibility issues with certain kind of tanks, piping, and the types of fuel. We know that ethanol, reacts differently to materials than non-ethanol blends. So we now have that information at our fingertips, and I'll show you here in a minute. We also kind of provide some geospatial context for this data. Importantly, like receptors, right? So if there's a release from an underground storage tank within the database, and I'll show you, we know, how many private domestic wells are nearby. It's kind of the one of the primary receptors of concerns are private domestic wells, right? Fuel releases into the groundwater, and it gets, that well is like a straw, and it'll suck up things like benzene. We also identify our UST and LUST universe proximity to public drinking water supplies, and I'll show you that too. And of course, we'll be talking about flooding throughout the hour. We do not want water in or around our tanks. And in this map and this data really kind of highlights those issues. And lastly, just we're looking at just populations in terms of potential exposure. So with that, I'm going to just pop open UST Finder. This is publicly available. And I think there's a link in the invite to this, but here it is. Here we're just aggregating all the facilities by county. The darker blue, the more facilities in a county. Things get a little bit more interesting. We can zoom into any area in the country, and we can just first visually assess kind of the density of our underground storage tank facility universe. Here we wanted to catalog both active underground storage tanks and ones that have been closed out. If a tank is kind of removed or closed, there can be like residuals in place. We wanted to kind of keep both historic and current data. The current data is shown in blue here, and the historic data is shown in light blue. So there's a lot of information kind of embedded in this. And like Fran said at the beginning, there's a lot of data, 2.2 million tanks, 500,000 releases, 800,000 facilities. Kind of the first thing I want to point out is, here's Ohio and here's Kentucky. This is kind of the first time that we've been able to integrate state data into a national picture, which is great. We can kind of click on any facility and get more information about not only the facility, but the tanks located at that facility. With things like the number of open tanks, number of closed tanks, how many people live like nearby within 1,500 feet, 600 people that live right near that facility. Well, we have information about proximity to public drinking water supply. This is within a wellhead protection area, meaning that there's a public well within the drainage area of that underground storage tank facility. And I'll kind of go into this a little bit more later. We also have the tank capacities. Maybe I'll show one. So here we've got 3 10,000 gallon tanks. Now let's get more information about the individual tanks at that facility. I can just click a few buttons and look at the individual tanks. Now what we see here, the tanks at this facility, this is a BP. We've got 3 active tanks, all installed in 1982. So these are, relatively pretty old tanks. They're still active. If they're closed, we get the removal date. We've got the capacity, the substance stored. These are all gasoline. And then in terms of the kind of tank structure, we've got the wall type. The single wall, double wall, triple wall tank. And then of course we've got IDs that link to state databases if you need more information. That would be our, facility and underground storage tank data. And I guess, relatedly, we also have a layer on the releases. So every dot on that map represents an reported underground storage tank release. We've got the pink dots are ones that have been remediated, no further action, they've been closed out, and the red ones are active. And we provide a lot of the same information, or all the same information as we did with the facility, proximity to wells, people, land use, things like that. And I also saw somebody in the chat was asking about if this covers tribal lands. It does. You can query. So we're in the leaking underground storage tank data is what we're looking at. I can just click this little toggle here, and that says tribal lands, and it'll show me all the tribal sites. So that's included as well. It's all 50 states, DC, and all the territories. So that's just like a really quick overview, and I'm going to jump back to this later, but I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of kind of what this data looks like. We talked about like the importance of this data in terms of kind of understanding just the infrastructure. Like, what is it? How old are our tanks? What's the wall tank? What's the fuel in our tanks? And again, until like recently, we didn't really know. There's a blurb up at the top here from a kind of an industry blog, a fuels blog, but I thought it was pretty interesting that if we want to look at kind of the insurability, or maybe even the viability of tanks, we can look at insurers. What are they willing to insure? And basically, we're seeing that the insurers have made a blanket decision not to sell insurance to tanks over 20 years old, and even more importantly, not to renew policies that with tanks in excess of 26 years old. Well, we looked at all of our tanks. We looked at 415,000 tanks in the United States, and there's a graph of the installation date of those tanks. And we can see that the average age of our tanks underground are 25 years old, with 40% of them that are over 30 years old. So this may portend to maybe a clash with the reality of on the ground of how old our tanks are and the insurance industry. So I just thought that was an interesting note. Tanks are old. They're getting older every year, and they're also getting larger. And this is what this kind of graph shows here. This is the average tank capacity since 1960 to 2018. We looked at 1.7 million tanks and their capacities, and you can see a pretty clear trend here. This blurb at the bottom says the average tank capacity has doubled since 1989. So it went from about 7,000 to about 14,000 today. So in brief, the more fuel contained in the tank, and if there's a major catastrophic release, and there's obviously going to be more fuel released. So. I touched on this in the map of kind of showing the cross-border data between Kentucky and Ohio, and I kind of like to stress this again how important it is. Our underground storage tanks. The U.S. delegates our underground storage tanks program cleanups and inspections to states. So it's really the state responsibility outside of tribal territories to collect the data, do the inspections, do the cleanups. Well, this map on the right kind of gives a good example of kind of the problem. And I forget which states. This is one state, and this is a different state over here. And here we're looking at the underground storage tank facilities, and in particular, those within a source water protection area. Meaning that if there's a release from any of those tanks, it'll drain into a public drinking water system. Well, if I'm in state A over here, and I'm concerned about my public drinking water system, I don't know where the tanks are in state B, right? Because the data just wasn't available between states. This really provides this kind of cross-boundary information.
And
And
we'll talk here a little bit about then the impacts on both public and private water supplies from fuel releases. So we're shifting a bit now into some of the media impacts, and this discussion will be relevant not only to response, but as well to think about preparation and planning. How do we need to think about these potential contaminant sources and impacts on our water supplies? The next graphic just shows you how, just in terms of the graphic on the left-hand side, it's just a synopsis of how we look at leaks from our facilities. So the tank generally is sitting in the soil. However, we do have some tanks that are in the groundwater table, depending upon what that table is in the part of the country where you're at. So that contaminant can be transported through the groundwater and in turn can enter a residence or a building structure that may be in proximity to the contaminant plume. And obviously we worry about a drinking water well, be it a public or a private well, that could be pulling from that contaminant plume. And the biggest driver that we think about is for gasoline is benzene. Benzene is a potent carcinogen with a drinking water standard maximum contaminant level at 5 micrograms per liter. The gasoline composition in general for benzene is about 6,000, and that's going to vary as a function of the fuel type in particular. But for sake of discussion here, to think about what does this mean in terms of the drinking water standard relative to a fuel and the ability of the environment to attenuate that contamination. So we're looking at some factor of about 1 million that you would have a release and at one point and down gradient, a point of a receptor of concern. So what's in our favor here is distance and time. So to what extent you can create that distance or enhance the time of travel to that point of a receptor is going to be the key thing. So the closer you have those receptors, obviously, in terms of vulnerability and need to plan and react, that's going to drive a lot of that analysis. And then particularly for those where we have concerns about private drinking water wells or even a smaller system that doesn't monitor as frequently, the benzene odor and taste threshold are really not going to help much if we're in this zone that we're relying on odor and taste threshold. We're several orders of magnitude above what the drinking water standard would be. So if we indeed have a taste or odor issue, we know we've got a significant problem in that scenario.
Yeah, then I'm gonna kind of just touch on the public drinking water supplies and their proximity to our underground storage tanks and their leaking underground storage tanks. You know, the EPA collects information on, I think, some over 200,000 public drinking water wells in the country, both surface water and groundwater. And the EPA also delineates what they call source water protection areas. Right? These are just areas that hydrologically contribute to those wells or those intakes. So what we did is, we just looked at our universe. We looked at our underground storage tank universe, and we found that there's 210,000 active US that are within a source water protection area. That's represented in magenta there. Oh no, that's total. Within a magenta, we've got 64,000 US within a surface water protection area and 163,000 within a groundwater protection area, represented in blue. I guess the takeaway here is that basically half, 1 out of the 2 leaking underground storage tanks or underground storage tanks hydrologically contribute to the public water that we drink. So it's very critical to, of course, know where these things are. Do inspections, do remediations, and things like that. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Oh, and I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. I would like to just kind of also highlight, within US Finder, we have the ability to look at whether a leaking underground storage tank or underground storage tank is within a source water protection area. Here is just a kind of graphic here, and I kind of showed this before. We're looking at a release. We're saying, yes, this is within a source water protection area. Here's the source water protection area ID, the intake ID. And what we can do with this, if there's a release, we can look at state databases and just use that identifier to look at the water system details. How many people are served by that intake? Emergency contact information, what type of intake it is, and things like that. So we really would the goal here was just to easily query, understand, and be able to link to drinking water databases if there is a release or a concern of a release.
And here the key message is that for groundwater that's contaminated from an underground storage tank site, we need to think about where the contaminant plume is traveling, where we have an extreme precipitation event or we have flooding. So the plume indeed can be much deeper and travel farther than we would under relatively static conditions. So again, just to think about, yes, you may have a monitoring strategy or monitoring that would have been in place if there was a leaking underground storage tank. That could be totally upended under these alternative scenarios. So just need to think about where the contaminant is moving. And then the next slide, wanted to speak just briefly too about a public water supply known as a transient non-community well. And these are water supply wells that serve an average of more than 25 people for more than 60 days a year. So we do find these TNCs at gas stations or campgrounds or restaurants or hotels where you have not consistent use of the water supply by a consistent consumer. In general, we are looking at these at gas stations of concern because we have some 1 in 20 of these TNCs are located 300 meters from an active station. I think importantly too, under these types of scenarios, again, because with underground storage tank, either that is not already leaking, it could be inundated and fuel could be released. If we have this TNC, which in some cases is right on the same property of the gas station, we need to be ensuring that these are monitored. And in general for TNCs, those are monitored once a year, but a clear heads up if we have a scenario that we're responding to event to be sure to check these wells in particular. And then in the next slide, the other thing we wanted just to convey too, while VOCs, of course, are not routinely required, it's strongly suggested to do that, and in particular in areas that may be subject to inundation. And that could be, we'll get into different types of flooding in a moment, but in terms of where these facilities are and inundation, it's important to think about, in particular, benzene. And then last but not least, and this comes back to one of the key factors in looking at the critical functions that we need to establish nationally and at the state and local level, is this particular issue in looking at gas stations and looking at TNCs. We need to have the cross connection between the folks who manage the tanks programs at every level of government and the folks who manage our water supply, again, at every level of government. So we have this data exchange. So we know we have a leak at a gas station, or we know there's an extreme event or climate change occurring that the water supply could be impacted. This bridge in communication is absolutely essential moving forward. And this briefly just wanted to cover the American Water Infrastructure Act, which was passed in 2018. And essentially what this does is for the water utilities need to develop a plan and determine what are the sources of contamination in proximity to their water intakes, and that could be impacted by a release. And so this is different timelines, but in general, at the moment, the last timeline was last summer for the smaller units to comply with this act. But we also have a feature in US Finder that really helps the water utilities to identify where the gas stations are and have a line of communication. And indeed, they can generate this information through US Finder.
You know, like as we said before, one of our primary receptors of concern are private domestic wells, and these numbers and this kind of graphic kind of demonstrates that. What you're looking at in the map on the left are the private domestic wells within 1,500 feet of an active underground storage tank by state, right? So I mean, you can see that, you know, Florida, for example, has 120,000 private domestic wells near an active underground storage tank. And just, you know, looking at this nationally, you know, we got about 1 million wells within an active UST, and about 400,000 private domestic wells within 1,500 feet of an active LUST. Now this is like aggregated by state, as you can see. I'm going to show you in kind of US Finder how to look at that, look at the data. So here we're in Houston, Texas, and here we're just looking at the active underground storage tank facilities. And within this little filter button, you can click that, and we've got a little tab here that says private wells. And basically we can type in any number, you know, 100 or 10, and we can say, well, find me all of the underground storage tank facilities that have at least 10 private domestic wells within 1,500 feet. And I can toggle that, and here we go. And there they are. And we can do this also with the leaking underground storage tank data set as well. So I mean, you can see that, you know, there's you click on one of these and get the exact number. Now here we've got 152 private domestic wells within 1,500 feet of this site, which is pretty yeah, it's a lot, especially in the event of a release. So you know, you can see the neighborhood all on private domestic wells. So this is kind of really just an example of kind of the functionality and how we're kind of integrating this geospatial data of, you know, where wells are, where tanks are, where releases are. So yeah, I encourage you to come in here and play with that. Before I mentioned the source water protection areas, and I kind of want to show you that quickly, how to search for that. So here again, we're in Houston, and I want to know, of all the underground storage tank facilities, which are within a source water protection area that hydrologically drain into a surface water intake. And here they are. Or I could look ones that drain into a well, a public drinking water well. And here they are. So it's obviously a lot of public drinking water wells here, and these tanks do hydrologically connect. So I just wanted to point that out.
And now shifting briefly over to what does it mean with regard to petroleum vapor intrusion in structure surrounding these releases. At the bottom left there, you'll see it's a technical guide that we have looking at petroleum vapor intrusion, and it's a function of both, particularly for the soil and the groundwater, it's a function of both the concentration and the vertical separation that we have between the contaminant sources and basically a clean zone. So as an example for groundwater, we're looking at, for a lesser concentration of residuals, we're looking at a minimum of 6 feet of separation between the bottom of a structure and the top of the contaminant zone, just to provide a zone to reduce any potential for vapor intrusion into that structure. And then likewise for soil, the same. It's a function of the separation distance is a function of, the benzene concentration itself. So we're looking at this. So in a way, you'll think through as we talk about some of the groundwater level and the flooding data. If we have higher groundwater levels, then obviously we're reducing that vertical separation zone and increasing the risk of vapor intrusion into these homes. And so it's going to be important to monitor this with climate change. And this change in the groundwater level can occur for a lot of reasons. both from coastal flooding to inland flooding to major rain events, but something that we have to keep our eye on and ensure the protection of the individuals living in residences near these facilities. And we just here, just as again, a little bit of a schematic in terms of looking at distance to structure. So if we have greater separation laterally with regard to the source of the contamination and the residents, that gives us a level of protection in addition to the vertical exclusion zone. In general, as I suggested before, the concentration is important, the depth of the contamination, what profile of the media that we have. And Alex is going to show you here too, just in terms of US Finder as well. We can get some information just knowing where structures are relative to our facilities.
Yeah, so let me just pop that up in really quick and show people. So we're in Chicago here, and here are overall all of our leaking underground storage tank sites, both active and closed. And kind of one of the, if we're concerned about petroleum vapor intrusion, we want to know what structures can potentially be affected. So let's say we're interested in this site right here. We can just click this kind of near me tool, right? And we can set a search threshold, and we can, here it says 1,500 feet. And what we have here is what's highlighted are the number of buildings within 1,500 feet of that release. And the number here is 504. If we're concerned about, commingling of plumes, we can also look at other leaking underground storage tank sites that are also near these sites. So searching within 1,500 feet, we see that there's 3 releases and 4 facilities within this area. And then again, just to reiterate, we can look at the potential buildings impacted. Just as a quick kind of just phase 1, just kind of just high level analysis of the potential universe of affected buildings. And then I guess we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I thought I'd set up this kind of conversation with the this conversation about climate change and impacts to our tank universe by kind of just highlighting the IPCC report that just came out, I believe it was last week. So the 6th one they've done, and I just want to just kind of note kind of what they say needs to happen in terms of global emissions to avoid a 2 degrees Celsius degree rise in a 2 degree Celsius rise in temperature. And then also, if that happens, they also document, what that would look like in terms of a particular concern for us, wildfires, coastal flooding, and inland flooding, and pluvial flooding. Basically, the high level kind of overview is that, global emissions need to peak within the next 3 years. We need to cut carbon dioxide emissions to 0 by mid-century, and half those levels, half the 2010 levels by 2030, right? And they run a bunch of sea level rise projections within the report. And basically, in brief, the model shows up to 1 meter of sea level rise through 2010, and most of this occurring, after 2050. So that's kind of really the context of what the IPCC is kind of predicting in terms of sea level rise, given current projections on emissions. And I'll let Fran kind of go over that.
And then just briefly here for NOAA's report that just came out recently, they put in very stark terms what we're going to be presented with on sea level rise. Fundamentally, our ability now to really monitor the factors contributing to sea level rise we're able to do this in a way that's never been possible historically. And this is due to the technology and the data management capabilities we have now. Certainly the satellites can track the global ocean levels and ice sheet thickness and give us a much higher resolution data. So this is some of the best data coming out on sea level rise. And what we need to take away from this is the bottom line. On average, we're looking at a foot sea level rise across the next 3 decades. So the picture on the right-hand side shows you what that 1 foot looks like on average across the US. And as you see across the eastern seaboard, the south and the west coast, 1 foot is significant impacts on our existing facilities. And again, you can go to their viewer and get a very localized scale, what this looks like, what extent of flooding and at what time period, what is this progression going to look at where I'm at. It's a very, just an incredible tool for us to use both in planning and as well response. And the takeaway here is, yes, we have got a lot of work to do to think about our infrastructure, and particularly this tanks infrastructure, what this means for communities and ultimately our ecosystems that are associated with that. And then in the next slide, just very quickly, just showing you here, this is the coastal flooding and saltwater intrusion. And that's an important one for us because saltwater intrusion is very impactful to our underground storage tanks. The higher the salt content, the greater risk that we have for corrosion in our system. So we absolutely have to keep an eye on that. In the next slide, in terms of high tide flooding, we've seen a lot of reports coming in, particularly again on the eastern seaboard and the south. The days with high tide flooding are definitely increasing significantly. And then we just wanted to call your attention to the next slide to just some impacts from Hurricane Harvey in particular. From this particular event, there were over 500 facilities with 1,200 tanks that were inundated during Harvey with some 15 billion gallons. So it gives you an idea of the magnitude of these events and what this means for our infrastructure. Concurrently, as Alex described to you, the private domestic well data, we've got 250,000 wells that were inundated in Harvey and serving some 600,000 people. So I think this is also relevant to our folks who are responsible on the supply side and getting water and food and medicine, the critical supply issues at post events. We need to think about this community, the private domestic well owners, and getting water supplies to these communities. So the data that's embedded here will also show you where these wells are, where the facilities are that are inundated, and give you a good estimate on the water demand, particularly for those with the private domestic wells. And then the next slide, I just wanted to show you just very quickly, our Office of Underground Storage Tank has prepared a severe weather checklist that you can go through, and EST Finder has a lot of the data that's needed in this checklist. Obviously, there's some very site-specific and time-specific data that's needed that would have to be included, but this sets a good general line of information for that. So the next slide, just briefly want to cover the types of flooding that we're experiencing. Fluvial or river floods, of course, catch a lot of the media attention, rightfully so. We also have fluvial flooding from extreme rainfall events that we're increasingly seeing in urban areas. Groundwater floods are the sleeper because of just the inability to visualize and see what's actually occurring and that fluctuation. And then last but not least, certainly the coastal flooding in general. The next slide shows in terms of groundwater flooding, just the fluctuation that we're seeing across the country. Out west, obviously the droughts are dominating a big picture, and we'll get to that in a minute. But here just gives you a quick example for Wisconsin and how the groundwater level changes are occurring. And so they've been doing a great job in thinking about flooding and what that means to our infrastructure. And in fact, for some of the sites where we have residuals remaining, if the groundwater levels are getting higher, they're going back and revisiting some of these sites. So getting a handle on groundwater flooding is going to be increasingly important. And then on the next slide, in terms of looking at fluvial flooding, Alex, you want to cover this one?
Yeah, and I'm also looking at the time though. I guess we want to leave some time for questions, but I'll just quickly go over this. I mean, with the EST Finder, there's a toggle there. We can look at all the tanks and releases within a 100-year flood, and we look at this by state. We don't want our tanks in flood flood-prone areas. They can literally just dislodge, as this kind of graphic here shows. Basically, all we're saying is that there's about 250 million gallons of fuel lying within our floodplains. And we can go into US Finder and actually find the specific locations.
And on this one, just to really capture this, a summary of the flooding. So yes, we have a variety of flooding. The infrastructure concerns are corrosion and actually losing tanks or dislodging tanks and ultimately having an impact on our water supply. And the next slide too, just want to call your attention to the Office of Underground Storage Tank has a flood guide and absolutely a good resource to consider. The next slide too, and looking at shifting now from flooding to drought, bookmark this drought monitor if you haven't already. This is going to be a good indicator of what we need to be thinking about in terms of wildfires, number one, and two, how drought affects subsidence as well. Here again in the next slide, the Office of Underground Storage Tank has information specific to a wildfire guide and really walking through the information that's needed in assessing this. And then, do you want to cover this one real quickly, Alex?
Sure. Just within US Finder, we've got a innate layer in there, and that basically we can go and within the database lives a current wildfire perimeter, so we can see there's a active wildfire going on right here, and we can look at the kind of co-locations of our facilities to our wildfires. Right, a really handy tool.
And then here, just a depiction too in terms of Alaska. Alaska doesn't get a lot of press in the continental United States. There's been significant wildfire seasons there, and it's certainly important as well to the state and to our tribes that are located there. Ultimately, what we're worried about after a wildfire is the debris flow fields. And this depiction here just gives you a quick synopsis of what can happen when you have these kind of events, and it really alters the hydrology of the environment and the potential for these debris flow fields. And the next slide here, in terms of subsidence, yes, with drought is a huge issue with regard to subsidence because it occurs generally by over withdrawal of groundwater. And increasingly, we're seeing this in areas that are really at risk with regard to delivering sufficient water supplies and really having a good balance at a regional and local level of the groundwater levels. And the next slide shows you just very generally in the US, where are these areas that we have of concern. And the next example just gives you an idea within the Houston-Galveston area, how we're looking at that spatial and temporal variability in subsidence. Significant loss there. Texas has been working hard to look at this at a regional level and getting better information and more localized information on groundwater. And then very quickly on earthquakes, just a quick capture here in the upper right-hand corner where we need to be thinking about earthquakes and that potential. And in general, we also have seismic events from injection of fluids. There's obviously areas of concern nationally regarding that too. And that needs to be considered in how we look at our infrastructure and the vulnerability of that infrastructure. The next slide is just a very quick link to California's approach in looking at earthquake damage and what that means to underground storage tanks. And to wrap up, the next slide on climate change, certainly permafrost again is an important one. And here we're looking to our folks in Alaska in particular, and looking at these major shifts that are occurring in temperature regimes and the decline of the permafrost, and ultimately what this means in terms of the impact of the infrastructure and the potential for leaks there. So in the next slide, just really the takeaway here in terms of how we think about the sites and certainly engage with this community in both considering both the planning and our response. So yes, the things that we've showed here today in terms of climate change and what does that mean for our infrastructure, really time is of the essence in thinking about extreme weather and climate change and preparing for what is going to be at our front door. And this is protecting the infrastructure as Alex has identified. We have that information. how do we look then at the supply chain, and both for the fuel and water supplies, and how that's interrelated in considering our planning efforts and ultimately to protect public health. And UST Finder indeed provides this very information on both planning and response efforts with regard to the critical infrastructure, these supply chain issues, and last but not least, the implications for water supply and indoor air for public health. We have an aging infrastructure. We know we've got vulnerable areas, and we're looking that we need to protect these facilities and protect the communities to enable them to come back home in a safe environment. And I think that the takeaway here from Alice Hill is basically the bottom line is, yes, our past is not our future, and we need to be thinking about this in a very dynamic way and preparing for that. And yes, the last here is our contact information and further links. And as was mentioned at the top, the slide deck will be available to you as well.
Great. Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Alex, for that wonderful presentation. Fran or Alex, could you put up the last slide? We have that up there so folks can get your contact information and those helpful links.
Yes, good idea.
In the meantime, I'll go ahead and start asking some of these questions. If we don't get to your question, please feel free to send an email to both Alex and Fran, but we will try to get through as many as we can. So the first question here is, does the UST Finder only include tanks that hold petroleum fuels, or does it cover other types of tanks?
It's all federally regulated substances. So it's mainly petroleum, gasoline, hazardous substances. Home heating oil consumed on site is not a federally regulated tank, so that's not included, but in brief, federally regulated substances. And you can find those on the link on the screen, the epa.gov/UST.
Thank you. Next question is, does the UST database include underground storage tanks located in private properties?
If it's if it's storing federally regulated substances and it's on a private property, yes.
Question is the data source for the UST primarily from home insurance data? Are there other data sources that are inputs for the UST Finder?
All the data sources from all the states. Basically, these are state delegated programs, so it's DEQs or state EPAs in their prevention and release departments. So they're the ones in charge of collecting the data on a state basis. This is just a aggregation of that data.
And then someone asked related to that question, so if the states, what does this UST Finder provide, since the states already have access to this type of information?
Yeah, so a lot of the geospatial context in which we provided, how many wells are nearby is in source water protection. There are some states that don't have spatial information, so we actually were the ones that put the point on the map. We talked about the cross-border issues. State A doesn't know what state B infrastructure looks like. So what are the implications to, connecting waterways, things like that. So I think it's just a one-stop shop for all U.S. underground storage tanks and leaking underground storage tanks, rather than going to 50 states.
And I just wanted to provide a little more specificity on the tanks that are regulated and the question about privately owned tanks. And so in general, as Alex said, yes, these have to be federally regulated tanks. And this does not include farm or residential tanks, 1,100 gallons or less. And so that's not in this horizon, or tanks on or above underground areas such as the basement. So we could put in the chat the information specific to those that are regulated, if that would help folks.
Although I would like to just caveat a little bit, because we got this data from states, there are some instances where we couldn't determine whether it was federally regulated or not, right? It didn't have the substance, or say that it was federally regulated or not. So, I mean, there may be instances in the map where there are tanks that aren't federally regulated, but that's just because we couldn't determine whether they were or not. Just a small caveat.
Thank you. Next question is, how frequently is the data updated?
So yeah, currently it's a snapshot. We've done some updates. Basically, depending on where you're looking, it's from 2018 to 2020, kind of depending on the stage or the tribe. With September of 2023, we're actually making this more automated. Well, there'll be twice a year updates of all the data. So currently it's a snapshot, but within a year and a half, we're talking about regular scheduled updates of refresh data.
Next question is, are tank locations provided by facilities or can they be reported by the installer? If they can be reported by the installer, it would be easier to count underground storage tanks in areas where little is known. And they provided tribal lands as an example.
Fran, do you want to take that?
Oh, yeah, sure. In general, our Office of Underground Storage Tanks works with our regions and our state partners and have measures that are laid out to oversee these sites. And as part of that too, the states maintain their own database. I don't know, Mark Barolo, are you by chance on the line? No, okay.
Well, I don't think non-presenters can speak.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if we could or not. Okay. I was just thinking if Mark was on the line. Mark Barolo is our director of the Office of Underground Storage Tanks, and he could explain in much more detail about the interface between us and the states. But in general, no, in terms of the consistency and the quality of the data, we would want the states to be in the position to look at that data, review that data, and then provide that data to us. Because otherwise it would be, we could have, I think as Alex mentioned, we have already 150 different databases just from the states that we're managing and pulling this data together. And if we went down to every individual facility, the data management, data quality issue would be much more significant.
Next question is the definition or requirements for whether a leaking tank is active or inactive a federal definition, or is there any standardization across states?
We can put in the chat some of the regulatory requirements. I'm happy to do that and give you some good background on this. But again, this is our Office of Underground Storage Tank who has oversight on the regulatory and the policy issues associated with tanks. And we'll do that momentarily here.
Next question is, how is the density of private wells estimated?
Yeah, so that's data that Fran and I and a couple of other colleagues developed. And I think I'm sharing my screen under the private domestic wells bullet. There's a map of all the private domestic wells nationally and a publication there. And within that publication, it gives the methods for estimating these wells. I would like to go into it more, but it's nothing I can kind of describe in a minute. So just take a look at the publication.
Yeah, and if whoever provided that question, you can also email Alex for further discussion.
Yeah, definitely.
So the next question is, does the tool have the ability to see remediated locations after releases?
If I understand that correctly, there's a leaking underground storage tank site. It's been remediated, closed. Do we show that data? If that's the question, yes. When I show those red dots, the dark red ones are active, and the pink ones are ones that have been remediated and closed.
And just one last question before we close out here. Does the UST Finder have an API connection available?
Yes, it does. Somebody whoever asked that, shoot me an email, and I'll send it to them.
Well, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all for attending.
Hey,
We
thank you.
appreciate the opportunity, and feel free to send any questions or follow up to Alex and me. Appreciate it.